Here's a U.S. history-themed GRE critical reasoning question. Let's take a look. The presidential election of 1948 featured unpopular incumbent Harry Truman running against challenger Thomas E. Dewey. To conduct polls, journalists called thousands of households, and the results were clear. Truman, from Missouri, was expected to lose in a landslide to Dewey, a New Yorker. The next morning, however, President Truman was declared the winner, having secured the popular vote and the Electoral College by a healthy margin. Based on the information provided, which of the following best explains the paradox above? Well, what is a paradox, if you're not familiar with this word? A paradox is something that you don't expect to happen. And that's the case here, right? All of the polls were saying that Dewey was going to win, and yet Harry Truman won. So we want to figure out something that could possibly explain why that happened. All right, I'm going to bounce around from question to question or answer to answer, and we'll eliminate them one at a time as we go. New York had more electoral votes than Missouri at the time. That doesn't resolve the paradox at all, right? The paradox is he was expected to win and then he didn't. It's not like nobody knew how many votes New York had and how many votes Missouri had. For those of you watching outside the United States, the Electoral College is a wonky system. So read more about that if you're interested. But that one does not explain the paradox. Okay, let's jump around to E. Truman had not been elected president in his own right, only assuming the office after the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Well, for those U.S. history buffs here, that's a true statement, right? Truman hadn't been elected the first time. This was his first time actually running for office. But again, it does not get at the paradox. It doesn't get at the unexpected, the reason for this unexpected win, right? Let's go to answer option D. The third-party candidate took votes away from Dewey. Again, this might have been true in the real world. I don't know, right? Whether or not it was true doesn't matter. But again, it does not resolve the paradox. It doesn't explain why the polls were wrong, right? Because all of these, the ones that we've done so far, A, B, and E, were baked in, right? They were known before the fact. Okay, so we're down to these two. The next one we're going to eliminate is D. Dewey was extremely unpopular in his home state. What does that matter, right? What does that matter, or what does that have to do with expectations? The real key here is expectations. That's the paradox. Truman was expected to lose, and he didn't. The correct answer is actually answer option C. And you might be looking at this and saying, like, what? What does that have to do with anything? Households with telephones tended to have higher incomes. It doesn't mention telephones in here. Or does it? Or does it? So this is actually a pretty well-known polling story in politics, right? Telephones were, I suppose, relatively new back then, right? And so if you had a telephone in your house, it meant that all else equal, you were probably a little better off. You were a little more wealthy. And wealthier people, apparently, tended to vote for Thomas E. Dewey. And so by calling the houses on their telephones, right, these pollsters got it wrong because their sample was not a robust one, right? And now I want to address something. You might also say, well, like higher incomes isn't mentioned in here at all. How am I supposed to know that higher income people voted for Thomas E. Dewey? You don't have to know that. The point is that one link in the chain is flawed here. This argument depends, or rather I should say this story depends on getting a robust sample, getting a healthy sample of people. And we didn't have that. So because the telephones are linked to some other trait, doesn't even have to be voting for Thomas E. Dewey, but it's linked to some other trait that creates doubt in the results of the polls. So the correct answer here is C. For more GRE tips and tricks or to sign up for my online course, follow the link on my profile.